Morning.
Welcome back to Uncle Pete's Corner. This is WX Live Webinar number 90 on November 8th on the dark hour of the morning. And we got a part one, part two on this thing, we think. And we got some cool stuff to show you from one, did you say one entry field? One type of
Yep.
entry field.
Yep.
So
Yes.
it's all yours, man.
All right. Good morning, everyone. Uncle Pete's Corner has returned with his new view of the canal, and I promise to get the photos updated so that y'all can enjoy my new view along with me. But what we're doing today is a number of things. We're using the Gmail style entry control. And if anyone's never seen Gmail, they've got some really nice interface stuff. And one of the things it incorporates is Lookahead typing into entry fields. But that's only part of what they do. There's a bunch of features even beyond that. But today we're going to mainly cover the Lookahead feature because that is a feature that I've seen a lot of requests out in the forums and stuff about how do you do look ahead entry type fields in WebDev. And we're going to look at my approach to that. Part of the other reason that we may not get completely into it is it may not be completely written for some of the other stuff yet. But if I don't show it, then you can't prove that. All right, so let's start out with what is this Gmail entry field thing? Let's start an email. Obviously, the to field starts out blank. If we put an A in there, notice our combo box shows up and has 6 entries in it. And me and Arnold were discussing before we started recording. Anytime I'm working on web design, there's 2 or 3 places that I start going and looking at how they're doing interfaces. Google's one of them. PayPal's another one. The guys are just very good at doing very subtle, feature-rich interfaces that aren't in your face, but when you start really dissecting them, there's a lot of features being accomplished. And this is no exception. Uh, First, they always limit this to 6 selections. And the reason they're doing that, I suspect, is speed and simplicity. But how they're selecting those 6 selections is even more interesting. Because right now, I just typed the letter A, and we're seeing everything, the name starts with A. Now, if I press L, now we're seeing the first selections are names that started with AL. However, then it didn't find a total of 6 names that started with AL. So then it started looking for names that had AL anywhere in the name. And that's the reason Mike Alexander and this email address from a litho are in there.
Oh man, that's crazy.
Now it still didn't get 6 matches. So the next thing it did was look for any email address that starts with AL. And that's the reason Joseph Sheffield is on the list, is because his email address starts with AL. And then finally, if it still didn't find 6, then it would look for any email address with AL contained anywhere in the email address. So, I mean, what they're doing here is pretty impressive with the the multi-layered amount of searching and matching that they're doing to get you the best matches as you type your email address. So that's one of the points here. When you're talking about a look ahead type entry field, don't necessarily just match up one field. It could be address where you want to match address line 1 or 2, or phone number where you might be trying to match cell phone, or home phone or office phone. So even though it's an entry field, you may be trying to match on more than one field. So keep that in mind with your coding. So that's the type ahead entry piece of this thing. Now, they take it a step further. When you select one, it fills them in so that you now have a list of the ones you've selected, and they have buttons that allow you to delete one of those if you no longer want that in the list. And also notice the fact that these buttons are variable length. Notice how the Angelic stored entry spreads across, so these are not like even columns. That was a feature I wasn't sure I was going to be able to do, but with some playing with the looper settings, WebDev actually supports that feature quite nicely. So that is what we're trying to duplicate today. So now, let's go over and see how close I got. Okay, first thing to know is my test address book that we're using has 435, I believe was the count, somewhere in that neighborhood, 485, yeah, 485 entries. So, you know, you're seeing live site 485 entries being matched up. So it's very important to know that this thing works quick enough that you can use it. And as we type, you see the list continuing to shrink just like it did on the other one. And the choices are constantly changing. And if we select one,
I think you're doing it.
yes, as you saw, the type ahead feature is working, you know, at the same speed you would expect out of a Windows app. There's no delays or anything happening with the type ahead combo entry. The only thing that I couldn't figure out how to do, and I maybe could if I really wanted to, but I just don't think it's a big enough feature to do, is Google actually has this looper here with their buttons, you know, of selected entries as part of their to field, and the to field kind of moves as they do it. That wasn't a big enough feature for me to work on. Instead, what I did was just below the to field, I do my looper there, and as you see, it expands. You know, as we continue to type here, when we go to a third row, the screen just expanded to accommodate that third row. And we have variable width columns, and we also have variable entries in these columns. If the names are particularly short, we will get more than 4 on a list. All right, there we got 4 on that row, but we've got 5 on this row. So we've got variable number of columns. The columns are variable widths. So that's pretty impressive considering this is a standard WebDev looper with just some additional settings. So that's what we've got. Anyone interested in the code, or, you know, should we just end the seminar and move on?
I don't know. Let's get people to raise their hands. Do you guys know how to raise your hands?
Code, code, code.
Oh,
I think Chris wants to see the code.
well, let's see if they know how to raise their hands. Go to the top of the screen. There you go.
There
Some
we go.
people know how to raise
There
their
we go.
hands. Yeah.
Yeah. Bob's probably sleeping.
Yeah.
Either that or, Moose ran through his living room or something. All right, so let's take a look at the code that accomplishes all this. First, we'll look at it in design time. This is that same screen at design time. I've got an entry field here. Nothing surprising there. Over here hidden, I have a looper that has, this is the looper that is emulating the combo box. So this is the looper of matches, and it's contained in a cell to give me that combo box look. And then over here is another looper, and that's the selected addresses. And that is contained in a cell. And this looper and cell here is what we're going to cover in part 2, because that's kind of a topic in and of itself. Because there are a lot of settings and so forth that make that thing work. But for the type ahead part, which is what a lot of folks have been asking for over the years, we can do all that without even getting into that looper. And let's look at the code. Here is the entire code. Can you see that, or do I need to blow that code up, Arnold?
It looks okay. Looks
All right.
good.
All right.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So the first thing to notice is this is an AJAX procedure, because we will be calling this via Ajax Execute. And all it's doing is passing in whatever is in that entry field. That's what this variable contains. We start out by clearing that looper that shows the selections, the matches, I'm sorry. Then we've got a couple of variables for the number of matches we find. This is my limiting. Google did 6. I'm doing 10 instead. But this is something that you'll see me do a lot. Instead of putting that 10, if I'd done that 10, I would have had to put it in the code here, and I would have had to put it in the code here. Well, now when I decide, you know what, Google's right, I should do 6, what would invariably happen, and don't ask me how I know this, I would change it here to 6, I wouldn't change it here, and now I'm in an infinite loop or something. So by using a variable, it lets me at the top of my code adjust that limiting factor without having to worry about any of the rest of the code. That's just one of those little, belt and suspender things. X is a little counter we're going to use, and I'll explain how that works a little later. And then comparison field is just a temporary field to hold the value that we're going to compare. And again, that's used to make our code a little generic. All right, so then we start out with a while loop. And what we're doing is we're saying while the found count is less than the number of entries to display. So until we're going to loop until we find 10 matches. Once we find 10 matches, the while loop will end, and we're done. Next thing we do is increment X, and then what that's going to do is the first 2 times through this, we want to work on name. The second 2 times through this loop, we're going to work on email. And then we have another loop, and this loop is the ForEach loop. That is stepping through an array. I'm using classes for the file management of this site. So my data is already in an array. When you log in, I load your address book into a class. So I have an array that has all your address book entries. There's no way this function would work if you tried to do direct database access. I mean, it would be horrendously slow. You know, and since it's a type ahead field, you're going to have to do, you know, speed is the important factor here. So however you accomplish it, you need your data that you're comparing for your type ahead into an array for this all to work. So the for each loop just loops through each record of the array. Now, interestingly enough, this next if statement here is a feature I added that Google doesn't have. So, you know, I am now better than Google. Google, as I was typing, you saw Alan Sheffield come up in the list. I selected Alan Sheffield. If I type Alan again, Alan Sheffield is still in the list to select. To me, it makes no point, you know, that makes no sense. Why would I add someone to the email list twice? You know, I'm not going to send them the email twice. So what this if statement is doing is if they're already in the list of selected addresses, then I use the continue statement to jump back up and look at the next record in the array. That keeps me from getting the same match twice. Now, this statement, what I'm doing is, again, that X is doing 4 loops. The first 2 loops, we want to use name for the comparison. The second 2 loops, we want to use email for the comparison. And all this code is just so that this code here doesn't get repeated 4 times. You know, it just makes your code a little more generic, a little cleaner. Now, here is the real magic. For the first loop and the third loop, so the first time through with name, the first time through with email, we're doing a begins with comparison. Remember, that's what Google did. It did a begins with on name, then it did a contains with name, then it did a begins with email, and then it contains with email. So if it's the first loop or the third loop, we want to do a begins with comparison. And strangely enough, there are a ton of ways to do string comparisons with WebDev. I chose string compare for this particular one, and I'm comparing name, which is the passed in variable that has the contents of the entry field, to the comparison field. And again, that's the reason we moved this in here, so that this code here doesn't have to know whether it's looking at name or email. That was accomplished with this code. And then the other trick here is I only want to compare, you know, if the entry field, if you've typed in 5 characters, I only want to compare that to the first 5 characters of the name field to see if I've got a match to that point. If I weren't doing this, it wouldn't give me a match because, you know, it'd have full name and only partial name in the entry field. So that all I'm doing is using string slicing to make the comparison field the same number of characters as the name field. I'm ignoring accents and case, and the string compare has some weird results, but a 0 means that we have a match. If we have a match, I add it to the looper, that looper we saw over on the side that holds our matches, and I increment the found count. And then after it falls out of the if statement, if the found count equals the number of entries to display, then we break out of the for each loop. And then because we've gotten found count greater, to the number of entries, the while loop will also fail, and we will get completely out of that, or out of this procedure rather. So then the contains loop, if it's X is 2 or 4, then it uses a contains comparison to see if the value in the entry field is anywhere within the comparison field at all. Again, if it finds a match, adds it to the loop or increments our count. And then finally, if we make it to here, once x equals 4, then we know we have exhausted all attempts. We've done all 4 of the loops, and then we just return whatever that found count is to the caller of this. Any questions on this code? Because this is the heavy lifting of the lookahead function. Everything else is just interface stuff. So any questions on the code before we move on to the interface?
You know when you were doing the comparison field 1 to length name, because you wanted it the same, so that's basically, can you explain that again?
Yeah, string compare says, is this string equal to this string?
Okay.
Well, if you've typed in AL into the entry field, that's not equal to Alan Sheffield. So I'm using string slicing so that I know AL is only 2 characters, so then this statement is going to say comparison field from position 1 to 2. So now I have the AL there, so now I can compare what you entered to the field and see if they match. I could do the same thing with doing a write statement for the length. You know, there's a lot of different ways to do that, but basically what I'm doing is chopping it off so that however many characters you typed in, that's how many characters I'm comparing.
Okay, and Chris is saying, why not use string start with?
Is there a string starts with? I didn't see that one this morning. Again, there are a ton of string function. I don't.
Are you looking
Yeah.
on your other screen?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, okay. It's an operator, not a function.
So you can't use that then.
Yeah, you can, but you have to write it as
a assignment kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. I'll have to do a little research on that. I will update that for the blog article.
Yeah, he has a link there for you.
Yeah. All right. Appreciate it, Chris. Yeah, I will update. I will use that function and update the article because that is cleaner. I didn't find that one when I was going through this code. Thanks.
The other question somebody had was, does this work in WinDev also?
I would assume it does. I mean, there's no reason it wouldn't. I don't know that you necessarily need it in WinDev. Don't you have Lookahead type combo fields already in WinDev?
Let's see who asked that. I think, yeah, Bob asked that. Bob, you guys have mics too if you want to turn it on when you have your question. Free.
Okay. Yeah. I still do some WinDev work, but by no means as much as I do WebDev these days. So, you know, most of what I show is from the WebDev side, but you know, there's nothing fancy here that you shouldn't be able to do in WinDev.
I think it's the expanding looper control you've got is the question. The type ahead would work, but I don't know if the looper would expand.
I can't imagine there being a feature of the looper that is in WebDev and not WinDev. You know, generally speaking, the features become more limited on the web, not.
True.
You know, so yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. Yeah, I'd be very surprised if it didn't work. When you do an email lookup, you only display the record name. You're right, because again, I'm always showing you your name and address. Not, and if you look, Google actually is showing name, email, and a tiny picture in their looper of matches. I'm keeping my interface a little cleaner, and for this instance, I don't need that much input or anything. So yeah, I'm just always showing name, but that's easy enough. You know, you could do looper add and just do comparison field here instead of name. If you wanted whatever the match was on, all you'd do is instead of record.name, you would do comparison field there.
Hey Pete, when did you create that array outside of this?
It's actually done at login time. Is when you log in, I load your entire address book into an array.
Okay.
Because I'm using it all over the place for, you know, this site is a reminder site, basically, you know.
Oh, your PC reminder.
Configuring email, right? You know, you're configuring reminders to send to people and stuff. So I'm constantly doing things with. So what I've got is I've got a class that is the member, the user. When you log in, that class loads up your reminders, your address book. It's one giant class that all I do is pass it your email address and your password. One, it verifies whether or not, you know, you've got your password right and actually logs you in. If it does, then it loads up all your data that it needs to do everything through the entire rest of the app. So it's basically one class that manages the entire user experience from a data standpoint. Yeah, Carlos, for me, I don't really care whether the match was done on email or not, but you know, again, if you did the comparison field into the looper, then you would know. All right. Any other questions on the code before we move to the interface?
Yeah, Pete, I guess you can have an attribute there where you go, if you found it as an address, you color it one color, and you find it through the name, color it another color,
you could,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, you could get all kinds of fancy with it.
Craziness. Or an image. Yeah.
Right. Yep. Yeah, there's a lot you can do with it from there. You know, that the one of the beauties of loopers is they you know, pretty much can contain any kind of control. So, any other questions on the code? You know, it's the code is really fairly simple, and again, this is the most code intensive piece of the whole thing. The rest of it is kind of, you know, the WinDev style of coding, you know, checking boxes on description screens.
So does everybody understand why there's for loops?
Was that Arnold's way of saying he doesn't?
That's right.
Caught you, didn't I?
Well, the thing is, maybe I wasn't listening, man.
There's for loops because we have two fields, name and email, and for each of those fields, we're doing two different comparisons. We're doing a begins with comparison, and we're doing a contains with comparison. So that means we need to do four loops. The first loop is name begins with, second loop is name contains, third loop is email begins with, fourth loop is email contains. I could do all four comparisons in one loop. The problem with doing that is now I'm not giving priority to name begins with. You know, if I would get my 10 matches, but they could be any of those four matches. I want to, you know, if there are 10 matches with name begins with, that's what I want. So I'm looping through four times, doing the comparison, you know, stepping through the priority of the comparison until I get a total of 10 matches.
Thank you. I'm sure I'm the only one that missed that, but thank you.
All right. So let's look at the interface.
Sorry, just one question.
Yes.
Just dawned on me on that code. From what I can see, you're only breaking out if you've got 10 or more. What happens if you haven't got 10 or less?
The fourth loop will get me there. Hang on just a second. Let me get back over to the code.
There.
Right here.
If
Once it's gone through 4 iterations, this break here will throw us all the way out.
Okay,
yeah.
No problem. Thanks.
Yeah, and I know that code needs to be there because I was wondering why it wasn't working before.
Got caught.
Okay. Yeah, when I typed in too many letters, all of a sudden I never got a response.
No
So yeah, the old the way I tend to code loops is to code them with infinite loops and then find them at runtime.
Yep.
Seems to happen to me every time.
Thanks.
Okay, so let's look at the entry field. And like I said, I promise you this is going to be pretty simple stuff. This is all the code that's behind the entry field. This is that function that we just looked at. We're using Ajax Execute to execute it because we're on a browser here, and that function is a server function because it's doing a lot of stuff that you can't do in browser code. So we have to use Ajax Execute to execute that function. Ajax Execute functions only return a string value. Even if you've got that variable defined as numeric, integer, whatever, it's going to come back as a string. So again, belt and suspenders thing, I use the val function on that to make sure that I'm doing this comparison as a numeric comparison, not a string comparison. And all it's doing is, if we got any matches, then it displays the cell, which that is this cell right here, our combo cell. And it presses the button, refresh address book looper. And I'll show you why that is in just a second. Otherwise, it hides the cell. If there are no matches, it hides the combo. Okay. The spot that we put this code is interesting. If you were to put it in exit with modification, then it would only work when you tab off the field or mouse off the field. So we wouldn't have our type ahead function. If you put it on key press, it only works, or it fires when you press a key, but the entry field does not have that key yet. So I had to put it on key up so that it fires when you type and after the entry field has been updated with the value you typed. And normally these fields are not, let me find other, normally you notice that we don't have those other events. If anyone hasn't gotten into WebDev enough to get to those other events, you have these little shortcuts here, or you can pop up the ellipse, and like we want to key up, we just click it there, and now we have the key up event. So that's how you get those other events if you need them. Whoop, did the wrong. All right, so that's all the code that's behind our entry field. All right, why am I pressing this refresh button? Let's go look at that button first. And this is one of those foundational things that I've talked about in a couple other webinars. There's a couple of tricks that if you learn them, you'll use them over and over and over again in WebDev. One of them is hidden buttons. The other one is hidden entry fields. This is the hidden button trick. So this is that button. It's hidden. It has a total of one line of code: looper display, looper address search, TA init, which that's this looper, and all it's basically what it's doing is refreshing that looper, because our search function filled that looper with new matches. This call here refreshes that looper so that we can see it. So what you may wonder is, why don't we just do this line of code right here inside our function? The reason why is because we're calling this function with Ajax Execute, and when you're in Ajax Execute mode, things that you try to do to the screen, like changing screen variables and so forth, don't get displayed. So that looper display won't have the effect that you want it to have. It doesn't give you an error, and I believe it's actually refreshing the looper, but the page doesn't get refreshed, because when you're doing an Ajax Execute, you have completely severed browser and server. That Ajax Execute is executing that function kind of in its own memory space over on the server, so it doesn't have the same access to the screen that you normally have with your server code. Now you'll notice this button is Ajax Enabled, because I don't want the entire page to refresh. I just want the looper to refresh. If this wasn't Ajax Enabled, then the whole page would refresh when this button got pressed. And Ajax Enabled is different than Ajax Execute. And don't ask me to tell you the whys of that. Just trust me. I've beaten my head on that wall enough that it's a bit of black magic, but I understand the black magic enough to use it now. And that's the key for me. When there's code that I do Ajax Execute on, I don't do anything to the screen directly inside that code, because it just doesn't work right. Does that make sense to everyone? And this is the other thing I found out is, when I first started working with WebDev, I was doing a lot of Ajax Execute code. And slowly but surely I found out that rarely do I actually need Ajax Execute. Most of it I can do behind a button with Ajax Enabled. And if I can accomplish it that way, that's generally the way I do it. The only time I truly use a function and execute it with Ajax Execute is things like this, where I've got that routine that I want it to do some lifting on the server and pass me back a result. Any questions on that?
Well, that's pretty subtle, but that's a good experience bringing you there, huh?
Yeah. That's the, year and a half, 2 years of working with WebDev, the things you learn stuff, which is, the whole point of these webinars is to save other people that year and a half of beating your head on the wall. All right, the cell that all this cell does is basically emulate a looper, or a combo box rather. No real magic here. It's not visible at start, and it's marked as can be overlaid. The reason that it's marked as can be overlaid is when it gets moved over here and it expands based on the size of the looper, if it wasn't allowed to be overlaid, the other controls on the screen would get pushed around by some of the browsers and look ugly. We don't want that. We want the combo box look and feel, which is it displays over the top of the other controls. So that's the only two settings on the cell. Last piece on that cell is on the onload event, which is, this is browser code when the page first loads. I'm changing the X and Y positions of that cell based on the X and Y positions of the email entry field, this field. So I'm moving that cell over here right below it so that it looks like a combo spot. I could do that right now at design time. I could drag that over here, but then it'd be a PETA working on the screen because that would be laying over the top of these fields, and you know, every time I needed to get to this looper, that one would be in my way. So I just throw it over here off the screen and then move it over where it should be at runtime. Just, you know, just a little handy trick. In WinDev, we don't have to do that as much because we have the planes, and we can put stuff on different planes. In WebDev, we don't have planes, so that's how I accomplish that. And that's the other reason that that field has to be marked as allows overrides, because this will give you a compile error. You can't access the X and Y coordinates if the field's not marked for overlay. And the reason why is it's not marked for overlay. The browser is managing it instead of your page. Okay, so that's it on the cell. Now we can look at this looper.
Where did you
That
mark
looper
this for overlay? Where did you mark that?
Yeah, almost every control has that, and it's usually on the GUI tab.
Okay. Okay, gotcha.
And it's weird, this one's, yeah. So if I turn that off, notice how you got the crosshatch on that button now?
Mm-hmm.
The reason why is because, you know, it's not allowed to be overlaid, but it's not contained in the page. So, you know, that those crosshatches are indicating to me that there's a problem. Now, even further, you know, if I drag this onto the screen, notice the crosshatches disappear because it's okay. But if I drag it over another control, notice how that control turns pink?
Yeah.
That's letting me know that I can't put it there because one of these controls is not allowing an overlay.
Sweet. Pretty subtle.
Yeah, that's all the stuff that they do for us at runtime to, you know, give us a hand. All right, let's talk about the looper. The looper contains one link, and this field is a link. And all it does is execute the code for a click. If we look at that code, I've got both browser code and server code behind that link, and both on click. So when you click on, you know, you typed in part of a name, you got your list of 10, you click on one of them. From the browser side of things, we want to clear the entry field because, you know, we're setting it up for your next selection, and we want to hide the cell, the combo box. So that's what we're doing on the browser, is basically, you know, clearing it, getting it ready for the next entry. From the server side of things, we add the record to, again, I've got an array. Now this is different. You know, we have an array that has your address book entries in it. This array contains the address book entries for this particular reminder. You know, what are all the addresses that we're sending this reminder to? So all I'm doing is adding the selection to that array. And if we go back over, you'll see that that's the array we used for this comparison right here to see if the entry is already in the list for this reminder, and therefore we don't show it as a possible match. So that's where those two arrays come back together. So then we add it to the array, and then we refresh this looper, our looper of selected addresses, we refreshed that. Because that looper, if we look at this looper, there are a lot of fields here, so it's hard to get the looper. If we look at this looper, it's based on that array that we just put that entry into, and that's why doing a looper refresh there refreshes that looper and shows the entry that we just selected. And then if we look at the looper real quick, nothing extraordinary there at all. It's got two attributes. The name, we're going to replace the caption of the link with the name attribute. And then we also have an attribute for address book ID. And here's a little tip that this is something that I just really picked up in the last month or two. I used to always think that I needed to do a static field hidden on that looper to contain work variables like this right here, address book ID. You don't need to do that. You just don't assign it to a control, and now you have an attribute that you can put a value in just so that you can access it later. And you'll see me doing that.
Oh, can you say that again?
All right, this will help you get you there.
Okay.
See, when you click on that link, loop address search.address book ID contains the address book ID value. This is that attribute we're looking at. Loop address search, address book ID. And now if we go look at the code right here, looper add, name, address book ID, those are the two fields. You know, when we use looper add line, we're adding a line to the looper. This is attribute 1, attribute 2. So I'm putting address book ID in attribute 2. Attribute 2, address book ID. And again, you know, this is an attribute. It's not linked to a control or anything. It's just a placeholder. And then we look at our code behind our link. We use that attribute to get the value of the address book entry.
Thank you.
All right. That takes care of, at this point, we've accomplished the type ahead, the look ahead, whatever you want to call it, type of entry control. The only thing left is our variable column length looper. And that's going to be part 2. We'll cover that next week. And the reason why is it's going to get very deep with workaround kind of things that you have to do to make that thing work. And I don't want to bog down the type ahead with that stuff. I want you to have an opportunity to absorb the type ahead in and of itself. I'll give you a brief preview. This is a cell that contains that looper and everything. And if we drop that cell down, oh, actually, that's the wrong one. It's this one. There's that cell. All of these controls. Here we go. There it is. all of these controls, there's our name, our button, the little red circle delete. But these spaces, if we select them, you'll see that there's one here, there's one there, there's one there, and then that's actually the name. The reason for all those spaces is we're taking advantage of browsers' ability to stretch things out automatically. You know, even if I define a field as being 10 pixels wide, if I put a string in there that's wider than that, the browser automatically shoves that out and shoves everything else over. The only problem with that is I would lose my spacing, because the other thing, and there's a feature of cells that probably a lot of people have not played with, the relative positioning of controls is a very powerful feature on cells, and we'll get into this next week. What that does is lets things bump up against each other, so no matter how big or wide they get, they bump right up against each other. And that's the reason I need to, because I'm using that relative positioning, everything would bump right up against each other if I didn't use those little spacers to spread things out. That combined with, on the looper, I set variable number of columns. Those two combined, along with a container cell, make that variable column with entry that you saw at the beginning of this webinar work. And it takes all of these, and I'll get into the details of them next week of the wheres and whys and hows of that. But that's a little preview of what's coming. And it took me a couple hours to get the type ahead entry to work. To get that looper that we're talking about now to work, I spent about a day and a half trying different combinations. So there's definitely some value in what's coming there, because it's a combination of anchor settings and spacers and cells. But I've tested it, and it seems to be working in every browser. So you know, it seems to be working. And like I said, you know, there's a little bit of playing with getting some controls and stuff in there and turning on some options on the looper and the cells, but you don't see me with you know, using, you know, a couple hundred lines of JavaScript, or using what's the JavaScript library everybody uses, Arnold?
jQuery.
Yeah, jQuery. You know, I didn't have to resort to jQuery or anything like that to accomplish it. It's all native WebDev. And, you know, anytime I can stay native WebDev, I feel like I've won the battle. So, any questions or anything on what we covered today?
Type in the chat, or open up your mic and ask Pete, Uncle Pete. Man, this is really cool stuff, man. I mean, there's a lot of tips that you just shared that you know, you've evolved over the last year and a half.
Exactly.
Crazy. Yeah. You know, think about the time you save a lot of us. Hour and a half here, 2 days there. You know.
Yeah. That's what makes the price of entry worth it.
Yep.
Wait a minute, we're not charging, are we?
Not yet. No, I'm kidding. Well, have Pete do your work for you. He can save you your headache.
Yeah, that is part of the point of all this. You know, I'd like to help folks out, but also, you know,
keep them
show you what I do and can do, so that, you know, if you've got something that you need done, you know, a lot of times you can toss it over to me and I can knock it out for you and save you the investment if you've got other stuff you need to be working on.
Exactly. Okay, if there's no other questions, we're gonna look forward to part 2 next week, Friday at the same time, 5:30. If there's no questions, we'll reconvene.
Doesn't look like it. Good deal. All right, we'll see you next
thanks
week.
again, Pete. Uncle Pete.
All right, yeah, next week, Arnold, we should be able to cover everything on that looper piece in half an hour or so.
Man. Yeah, I better clear my mind because I know it's going to be an intense half an hour.
Yeah, that we should be able to do in half an hour. If I know Ben was talking about doing something on the style sheet, so we may be able to put those two together if you want.
Yeah, or spread it out. It's all right. Okay.
All right.
Yep. I'll talk
Off
to Ben.
to work.
Okay, take care. Thanks again. Have a great weekend.
All right. Thanks a lot, guys.